Well, hello, folks. Another episode of Burning Platform. Brad Feld again with a new book and probably a whole bunch of new data on the state of the financial market. So, Brad, great to see you again. You're looking good.
Thanks,
Longer
Vinnie.
hair, something's different. Longer hair.
Always happy to see you. I think we just every year we age another year, right?
You talk for yourself. I don't.
Yeah. You look 17. You're holding tight at 17. That's great.
You're very generous. So, Brad, another book. I thought you and I must be the stupidest guys. Who is it's so freaking long, and what do you get at the end of it? No, seriously, tell me about your new book.
The book that just came out is a second edition of a book called Startup Boards, which I wrote the first edition in 2013 with my co-author Mahendra, and this book, which is about board of directors and focused on private company boards, not public company boards, and also very much written in sort of layperson's language rather than sort of technical legal language. What we tried to do with this book was really make boards and the concept of how startup boards work productive and accessible, both to CEOs as well as to existing board members and prospective board members. When Mahendra and I wrote the first edition in 2013, there really were no books about boards of directors, especially aimed at entrepreneurs and startups. So that was the goal of the first book. Having written a bunch of books now, when I reflected on that book, it was okay. The content of the book was fine, but the book itself didn't make me jump for joy. Some of it it's hard to write a book about boards. It's not boring. Like, it's just a challenging topic to kind of get in a way that is consumable. But there were a bunch of other issues with it, which we took advantage of the second edition to fix. We added a third co-author, Matt Blumberg. Matt is a longtime entrepreneur. I was on his board for many years. He had a company called Return Path, which got bought in 2019. But I was on his board with a couple of other well-known VCs, Fred Wilson from Union Square Ventures and Greg Sands from Costa Noa, and then a handful of other outside directors. So we had a very functional board. Matt now runs a company, Bolster, which is a marketplace for executive talent. So CXOs on one side and companies looking for CXOs on the other side. And it does both full-time and fractional in terms of the marketplace. So one of the categories that he focuses on is helping CEOs add board members and build boards. So he was very interested in this particular topic, given the amount of time he was spending on that from a business perspective. And what we did with this book, I think, is we fixed a bunch of things that made the book hard to get into. As an author, this, that with a business book, you want to make it easy for the person to get into it. You don't want to put a big wall in front of them in the first 30 or 40 pages. And, the steeper that wall is, the less they'll get through it to the page 50, page 60. And it's a classic problem with so many business books. I mean, the two problems that I believe exist is, one, that wall where it's just too impenetrable. You just don't get into it. And the other is, you say in 200 pages what you could have said in 20. And, there's a bunch of books on my bookshelf that are 200 pages long, could have been 20 or 30 pages long. So we smoothed this book out. We made it a lot easier to get into. We reorganized a lot of the content as part of that. We added a bunch of content that was aimed at prospective board members. So people who are interested in being on boards, which is also useful sort of reflectively for CEOs who are building boards. It's basically the same info, just from a different frame of reference. And then we did a couple of other things with the book that I think made it much more accessible. When we sent out the second edition or the first edition to some people and said, what can we fix in this book? Because we're going to do a second edition. We got feedback from a couple of women that, the most precise statement from one of them was, there's not a woman on your pages until page 82. And so this book does just not talk to me as a woman. And especially given the focus in the last 4 or 5 years on both gender diversity and racial diversity in tech, including on boards, that was a huge miss of ours. And in fact, when I sort of went through and refactored the book, we had about 20 sidebars from people who wrote stories of their own board experiences, whether it's CEO or somebody on a board, talking about specific topics that we asked them to talk about. And of those 20 sidebars, 2 of them were from women. So we refactored it, made about 10 from women, 10 from men. We sort of distributed it carefully, chose a bunch of sort of new contemporary voices, had a few people of color in the mix as well. So it wasn't all just middle-aged white guys prognosticating about how boards work. And as part of that, a big trend that's happened in tech in the last 5 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, has been this notion that you should either boards weren't important, the founders needed to control the boards, or you pushed off building a board as long as you possibly could. And I would say as more and more deals got done faster and faster, especially around the world, the board focus and the value of a board got lost. And in a lot of cases, really bad governance dynamics emerged, which for a lot of companies might not have mattered until all of a sudden they matter a lot. And examples are when you need to do something with, the company where you need a board and you need a vote of disinterested directors. And, if all you have on your board are founders and VCs, you have no disinterested directors, so you're stuck. And it generates additional liability and additional hurdles. I mean, other examples that they're not all legal technical ones, just in terms of the quality of the decision-making of the board and the cadence of how the board interacts with the CEO. The idea that, as you're building a board, wanting to think about your business scaling into a large company or even a public company and being in a position where you're not scrambling, with 6 months or 12 months to go before you go public to put new board members on your board who don't know anything about your company and have none of the history of building it. So we focused on a lot of those things, which it felt like the pendulum had swung way too far the other direction against an understanding of the value of a board from an entrepreneur's perspective. We tried to do that in the first book, but I just don't think we did it that well. And in 2013, it was a very different time in entrepreneurship. It was starting to be emergent again in a significant way. And there was a lot of momentum building in 2013, but certainly over the last decade, the amount of activity around entrepreneurship has been extraordinary, not just in the US, but globally. And it felt like a good time to reinforce this notion of from a CEO's perspective, if you're a CEO, why is a board useful? What can it do for you? How should you approach it? And what should you be concerned about? And really sort of putting that out in a way that people could really understand.
Well, pretty neat. Let's double click on a couple of things you mentioned. So let's talk about the gender and racial thing. The folks that you talk to, are these founders and CEOs of startups? Are they more corporate executives? What did who did you, from a board perspective, clearly you want gray hair, right? So what did you find?
Yeah, and I'm actually not sure you want gray hair from a board perspective. So I think you want some, but not only. The focal point was private companies. So it could be a startup with, has just raised a seed financing, or it could be, a 1,000-person company that's been venture funded and has raised tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars and it is on a path to being a public company. So it was sort of that spectrum. I think a lot of the stuff in the book applies to public companies too, but we really didn't look at it with a public company lens. We're trying to go after this much more emerging growth company all the way to the beginning of companies'
But even
journeys.
at the board level, you don't find public company executives that can relate to the startup world, or?
Well, it's very interesting, right? I mean, if you're a company that's a 20-person company, and you add to your board a CEO of a public company that's been a public company for 50 years, and that person's been CEO of that public company for 5 years, and you stick them on a board of a 20-person company, I can almost guarantee you they will be incredibly ineffective as a board member. There are some people that might be, but like the issues that 50-year-old, very large public company faces are very different than the issues that a 20-person private company faces.
And the value they would bring from a customer access perspective isn't significant enough to justify them. they're better as an advisor rather than a board member? Is that
Well,
what?
they might be a great board member, but one of the challenges is that the network that people bring is only one part of what makes them valuable as a board member. And for many board members, the network that they bring at a particular time in a company's life might actually not be that useful for the company anyway.
Right.
And so one of the things we did try to do a lot in this book is help a CEO think about the board. And there's a great line from Jeff Lawson that we quote early in the book. Jeff is the founder and the CEO of Twilio, which is a large public company now, about $1 billion in revenue and I don't know, $20-30 billion market cap. But he co-founded the company, so that he was there at day one. And Jeff said, "Look, I get to basically build two teams. One team is my leadership team, and I really am focused on building the right leadership team. And oh, by the way, the VP of sales for a very, very large company, a very large public company, might be a terrible VP of sales for a 100-person fast growth startup, especially if that person's never worked at a company with less than 10,000 employees." Right. So same kind of thing. It's not just, you think about the team configuration. You don't want everybody on the team to have the same skill sets. You obviously need different skill sets and different perspectives, but they need to fit with where the scale of the company is. And then he says, and I get to build a team that's my board as well. And yeah, the board can fire me. That's the thing that the board can do. And I recognize and acknowledge that. But as long as I got a board, why don't I try to make it a really highly functioning team? And interestingly, especially for private company boards, there is very, very little machinery in place in terms of how companies work, and relatively little experience for those CEOs to build teams. When you're a large public company board, and there are plenty that are very effective, and there are plenty that are horrific. The person who is responsible for building the board as a team is generally a lead director or the chair, and that chair may or may not be the CEO, but often, in today's society, is more often somebody that's not the CEO. And even if the chair is the CEO, there's still often a lead director on that public company board who part of their formal responsibility is to really help the board develop and function as a team. In a private company, you might have those same roles, but there's a lot less experience, training, focus, energy put into building that board as a team. And it's especially true when your board largely consists of VCs who are investors, or it might consist of a couple of founders and a couple of VCs who are investors, and then maybe an outside director, versus a board where, you try to balance it. You try to have the right balance between founders and investors and independent directors. So, the notion.
So Brad, we got a little bit. I wanted to focus on what did you find different with the different racial and ethnic group that you talked to this.
Sure.
What was different? Focus on the difference.
Well, a difference today versus a decade ago. A decade ago, I don't think there was much attention paid to having any sort of diversity on the board, whether it was gender or racial. And often there was not a focus on a diversity of experience either, right? When you talk to a CEO of a private company, a startup, and you say, well, who do you want to get on your board? Well, I want to get really experienced directors on my board. And, it's sort of similar to the comment of, don't you want a bunch of gray hair on the board? And the answer is, it is very valuable to have an experienced director, but there are also a lot of first-time directors or board-ready people who have not been directors in the past, who can be extraordinarily helpful and really effective directors at different stages of companies. One of the things that was a big shift, I think, I don't know the time frame, but in the last 5 or 6 years, was not just a focus on more gender and racial diversity broadly in tech in terms of founders. But if you look at the leadership of many tech companies, there's an increasing amount of, but I'd say probably more gender diversity, but also racial diversity appearing in leadership teams. And frankly, if a company is focused on that as a principle of the company, in other words, the CEO or the leadership team is advocating for and cares about gender diversity, to then have a board has, all white men on it, undermines that principle of the business completely. That's also separate from this notion that the customer and lived experience that people have doesn't necessarily match up in a monoculture type environment for leadership teams. So if you have, customers where, 50% of your demographic are women and all your board member are men, like you're going to have a very, insular view of what the product and customer experience is. Or if you're selling products where a big part of your market might be underrepresented or underserved populations, and you don't have any of that on your board, same thing. You're just missing the opportunity for people who understand the experience your customer is having, and not have it relate to your product necessarily just in terms of your product being better, but helping you shape the thinking of the business through those different types of experiences.
So let's talk about, clearly very different, right? In the last 5 years, we've had 20 years of prosperity. Well, the capital markets, maybe 15, right? It's a very different financial environment, right? Just put tech companies in general. Did that come out in is that come through in the book, or is
it comes through a little bit? I think, we finished the book before this downturn sort of fully kicked into gear. And I would sort of play with the time frame a little bit. I don't actually think it's been 15 or 20 years of quote tech prosperity, right? I think of it, especially from an entrepreneurial perspective. You had the internet bubble phenomena, which was kind of 1997 to 2001. Then you had a massive downturn in entrepreneurship that really lasted till about 2005, 2006 before it started to kind of emerge back. Now, there's a lot of innovation happening and a lot of new stuff created, but entrepreneurship and growth companies as a thing didn't really start to become a discussion until 2006, 2007.
Right.
And then we went headfirst into the global financial crisis. And, the global financial crisis was extremely challenging and disruptive for very broad swaths of the global economy. For entrepreneurship, it was an interesting moment because for early stage companies and for tech-based companies, 2007 was a very critical moment in time. The iPhone for me is one of the key turning points of the acceleration of the last 15 years of what's happened. I think AWS was another key turning point, and AWS really sort of kicked into gear about that same time. And by 2010, as the global financial crisis was ending, or we starting to segment out of it, entrepreneurship became focused on, or there became a focus on entrepreneurship globally as a way out of the financial crisis. It was the next wave of innovation and economic development. And even in that time period, though, and I think 2011, 2012, there was still very much a mantra that if you're serious about being a tech entrepreneur, you should just move to Silicon Valley. And if you're a tech entrepreneur and you didn't move to Silicon Valley, you weren't serious. And a decade later, in 2022, in 2012, I thought that was the stupidest statement on planet Earth. In 2022, that statement's been completely obliterated. Nobody says that anymore. And in fact, the notion of entrepreneurship really has been globally democratized. That was a theme of a book I wrote came out with in 2012, but I really started writing in 2010 and 2011 called Startup Communities. And the idea behind that book was that you could build startup communities anywhere. And in fact, every city with at least 100,000 people really needed a startup community as part of it. Not the center of it, but a key part of keeping the city alive and fresh and vibrant and growing and developing. And again, a decade later, I think that's widely accepted now. But in 2012, it was kind of a heretical statement. Yeah. And I think the dynamics of what's happened in that last decade has been extraordinary. We went from a world where there was this perceived concentration of innovation to a world where that place, Silicon Valley, is having trouble getting their employees to even come back into the office now. That those companies are globally distributed, and everybody is very comfortable working in a distributed basis for many of those types of businesses. That the idea that you have to be in a certain geography to have an opportunity as an entrepreneur no longer exists. And yeah, there's really substantial inequities between, for example, office workers and people who work in, manufacturing facilities, or people who work in physical stores and things like that. But the dynamics of how technology has influenced all of work and how companies as a construct function is dramatically different. And by the way, that rolls through the boards. When I started sitting on boards in the mid 1990s, the idea that you'd have a board meeting without everybody physically in the room was kind of, antithetical. And yeah, there were always board meetings where you'd have a conference. I remember when the Polycom conference phone got, everybody started having one in conference rooms, and then people would dial into the conference call and they do a board meeting on a conference call. And you knew that the person who was unseen on the conference call, was probably not really engaged. And every now and then they'd say something, but, probably they're in front of their computer typing on it. To now today, where, regularly, the vast majority of board meetings I attend are remote. Some of them are hybrid. Every now and then they're in person. So just the shift of the way we interact with each other in the last decade has reinforced this notion of geography and the importance or lack of importance of the sort of very tight geographic locations, which I think then links back to the diversity question, which is, as you get out of tight geographies, you get access to a much broader range of people who have talents and skills that can participate and work for and help your business.
That's a great point. Let's broaden it a little bit. So in terms of new startups, you almost get the sense, I've been working on a book where, I've looked at new energy trends, new healthcare trends, and so on. It almost seems like there's more excitement in other STEM disciplines compared to tech-centric startups. Have you seen a shift in the market in terms of where the money is going?
Yes, but I would be careful with the word tech here. So I think that I use the word tech with a pretty broad coverage versus just meaning software internet. In the 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9 timeframe, there was this clean tech phenomena that, ended up being, generally speaking, a very poor sort of investment dynamic for a variety of reasons.
I know,
not entirely.
I know Kleiner had a major focus and didn't do very well.
Yeah, there were a number, I would say, of IT software investors who became clean tech investors and had their heads handed to them. Today there's a very significant and powerful theme and focus around climate tech, which some people label clean tech 2.0, other people label something totally different. But even if you dig into what that kind of stuff is, there's a lot more, I would say, software and hardware innovation and much less project finance, which was part of the problem, I think, of clean tech in the 2007 timeframe. There's a label that people are now calling deep tech. And deep tech is things that are like, a space tech would be a category, right? Things that you shoot into space, which of course SpaceX is a canonical thing that everybody knows about. But there's now many, many companies, including a bunch of public ones, that are, space related. You also have, the entirety of the quantum computing phenomena, which gets, labeled in deep tech. You have overlap between bio and software and everything that's around bioengineering that's going on, and on and on and on, right? So I think one of the things that has become true, or a truism, is that tech is woven into every industry. And you can take a traditional industry, and I'll quote Steve Case as an example of somebody who talks about this regularly, which is this notion of he has this idea of the fourth industrial revolution or the next industrial revolution, the idea that it's not that manufacturing goes away, it's that manufacturing is becoming tech enabled. And you even see this within, I have a number of investments in the 3D printing industry. There was a wave of it, which was a couple of companies tried to brand this notion additive manufacturing 2.0. I think that was terrible branding, and I'm glad that branding sort of faded into the background. But, the notion of the evolution of 3D printing to the next generation of that technology and being embedded within industrial tech, but also being a desktop phenomenon. So, for people that don't know anything about 3D printing, a 3D printer today, in a lot of ways, has that industry has, with a different time scale, followed the laser printer industry. Where, when I was in college, I had to walk to another building and, I printed out on a Unix prompt over what was then the internet that we had wired up at where I went to school in the early 1980s. And, somebody took it off this gigantic room-sized printer and stuck it in a cubby that had a little F on it because I was Feld, and the first page had Feld printed in big letters, right? Like, you remember that. You're old enough to remember that dynamic. So today, for $200, everybody has a color laser printer on their desk or a color inkjet printer on their desk or whatever. Like, that phenomena is happening everywhere. If you think about the automotive industry and how much energy has gone into and how much money has gone into tech enabling the automotive industry, not just with EVs, but also with all of the software around mapping, around autonomous driving, all of that stuff is that tech-enabled layer within a traditional industry, which I would suggest 15 or 20 years from now, we're not going to recognize the way we used to do things today, or the way we did things today. It's going to look archaic relative to how that's going to continue to accelerate.
Yeah, the auto sector, there's a acronym called CASE: connected, autonomous, shared mobility or shared rides, and electrified. So I mean, the amount of innovation in auto, it's almost killing the industry, right? They've got so many different.
Well, it has to, it fundamentally has to reinvent itself, while at the same time dealing with, I don't know how many cars there are in the world, but there's a shitload of cars in the world.
There's 1 billion to internal combustion cars still, 20 million electric today.
And so, do you think those 1 billion combustion engine cars are going to disappear in the next 5 years? I don't think they're gonna. So, you have to deal with these massive transitions on a global scale, but with very, very rapidly moving disruptive tech. And that's fascinating because, it's no longer now happening in very tightly controlled geographic areas. This comes back to this notion of it being, democratized globally. You have people working on this, not just in Detroit, and not just in, 1 or 2 cities in Germany, and not just in the Bay Area.
Right. And talking to a couple of German auto guys, and they said our competition is China. So let's talk about that a little bit. What are you seeing from a global perspective? I mean, it just seems like, the doomsayers are saying it's the US is no longer the dominant global power. And what are you seeing from the tech perspective?
Yeah, I think that the prognostications in general are nonsense. And they're nonsense because they're almost always agenda driven, and they're so heavily biased by individuals' perspective on a specific category of things that are happening that they're exposed to. I think we're dealing with an extraordinarily complex system. Complex systems do not have deterministic outcomes, right? The inputs affect the outputs, which then become inputs. And we have many, many things happening that are exogenous to any of the things that people are trying to control. And I'll just give one example. I'm an investor in a bunch of companies that make things, hardware-related companies, and they all have big software components to them, but they make physical product, whether it's a 3D printer, or a wearable, or robotic devices. And the global supply chain has been a mess for the last 4 years. I would say the first part of that mess was the China-US trade war that, Trump started, or was started while Trump was president, I should probably say. We could decide who started it separately. I'll be non-political about it. But that was 1990, or sorry, 2017 timeframe, 2018. And, I remember 18 months of a lot of chaos around, should we move to Mexico? Oh, now we're going to have a border tax with Mexico. So actually the economics of moving to Mexico makes no sense. Do we have, how do we get through the tariffs on goods made in China? Do we have a Hong Kong operation? Like for very, very large companies, like that's that's a different phenomena that they have to deal with than for very small companies that are just trying to get stuff made, just trying to get their product into the market. And then, that was not anywhere close to being resolved. It was still emergent. Lots of things were still changing when COVID hit. And, COVID created an enormous dislocation in the global supply chain, of which it's been documented many times in different ways. And some of that dislocation was not just getting people into factories to build stuff, but if you think about the global logistics industry, not just boats on water, but all of the movement of products and goods and services around the world, that's been an utter debacle.
Yeah.
And, people talk about now, for example, pricing and inflation, sort of how you're trying to respond to that and think about that. And I'll just give two examples that are polar opposites. One is the shipping cost of a container across the ocean from Asia to the US, which really is probably going to come, from somewhere near Japan, or Hong Kong or Korea, or possibly China to one of the West Coast ports, has gone up by a factor of 4. Not 30%, but 4 times. That has a massive impact.
Oh yeah. The shipping companies like Maersk have had just an amazing couple of years.
Well, but then you have another problem, which is the length of time it gets to get product from point A to point B has doubled, and in some cases tripled. So you got to deal with all those things. And then, you almost certainly know this, and I don't know if your listeners know this. When you think about pricing and inflation and how the costs roll through the system to the consumer, and then you think about sort of things like reported inflation and government level reported inflation. There's a fascinating article in the New York Times, I think a week ago, where they did a breakdown of the costs of what's you pay for in a restaurant when you have dinner. And, they did the unit, the cost of, here's your dinner. This is why your price of your dinner has more or less doubled. And this is the unit costs that have showed those kinds of increases. And you realize that, for example, food is not included in core inflation in the reporting that the US reports and that most countries report. So, this massive change in logistics, by the way, fuel is not either, right? This massive change in the underlying cost structure isn't rolling through to the way that people understand how inflation works and how then there's this emotional response to it. You have all of these kinds of, I'm just describing like elements of the complex system. And then as you circle all the way back to the beginning, if you say to me, all right, well, Brad, what are your companies doing about it as startups? The vast majority of companies I'm an investor in are moving their manufacturing from China to either Mexico or the US. Most of those companies are changing their global shipping dynamics in terms of where they're selling and tightening down significantly what they're selling in North America versus what they're selling all over the world, and how they're pricing and how they're shipping and delivering. Those are all things that have resulted from those companies needing to be healthy businesses versus situations where now the markets will pay you and you'll be able to raise money at any point as long as you're just growing. Well, that's not working anymore. Now you actually have to either make money, or you have to demonstrate your growth with a rational bottom line. So when you talk about the global economy and the dynamics of these things, I think these things are all interdependent. And I don't think that there's easy solutions for any of the macro dynamics. And what will continue to happen in the same way that we recognize that war can be a physical thing, and we see that, like who would have thought there'd be a land war in Russia and Ukraine? But at the same time, we know that there's an economic war going on between China and the U.S. And that's about power.
Which is one of the reasons that it's a question. The Wall Street Journal had I think an opinion piece a few days ago where they said, Russia only supplies 10% of the world's fuel, and look how much chaos the invasion has caused. And they looked at how much China processes in cobalt and lithium and so on. And it's anywhere from 60 to 95%. And they go, and we're signing up for this. So,
well, there's also the view of the long game, which I think some countries play much better than others, which is a very, very systematic long view of what they're trying to accomplish versus an endless reaction to what's going on in the now. And I think it's pretty obvious if you polarize or position China versus the US, which country thinks which way.
No question. Well, let's go back to the boards again. Give me some final thoughts. Give me a couple more nuggets from the book.
Well, a couple more nuggets is, I'll give two. One is, when we finished the book, and I went from where, if I said at the beginning, it was an okay first edition, but I didn't love it. I wasn't like proud of it. I didn't feel like this was great work and we'd accomplished what we wanted. With this book, with the second edition, I feel that. I feel really proud of what we did. And a big part of it is, I think,
as an author, let me ask you that. Having not been happy with the result, how did you decide to do it again, but with a different, was that emotionally a tough decision?
Yeah, it's hard. It was quite hard. I had no plans to do a second edition of Startup Boards. And I credit all of it to Matt Blumberg, who joined as the third co-author. And Matt said to me, and we've been friends for a long time, so he knows me better than to have said this and thought it was really going to work. He said, "Don't worry, Brad, I'll just add some stuff onto it. We'll freshen it up a little bit and we'll release a second edition." He knows me better that I don't work that way. That's not going to actually happen. I'm going to need to be involved in it. And I whined and complained a little bit at the beginning of it after I said, okay, fine, let's do it. And then, then it looked like it was going to be a lot more work than that. And so I moaned and groaned a little. And then finally I said, okay, get over yourself, Brad. And I did. And I said, all right, let's get into this and really make this a great book now that we're into it. So it was hard. I would say it was a solid, it took us about 9 months to do, but it was a really solid 3-month focused, multiple, Saturday, Sunday, big chunks of the day. And then, throughout the week in the evenings, an hour here, an hour there of concentrated effort, even when you're tired from the day, but saying, all right, I'm going to chip away at this thing now. And the collaboration, I would say mostly the second edition was me and Matt Mahendra weighed in on a little bit, but the collaboration was really good because we know how to work together and we can sort of navigate through each of our own proclivities. And, it's also a project, as you know, having written a bunch of books, there is a halfway point, right? There is for sure a point where you're like, okay, now I'm on the downhill part of this project. It's not easy. The downhill still got lots of rocks and lots of twists and turns and, and there's lots of places where you go back up as you're trying to finish it. But that happened around the end of the year, I think, which was really helpful because it coincided with, all right, we got enough here. Now let's just get this done.
And so every CEO of a startup, tell me the audience, the ideal.
The audience, we wrote the book aimed at CEOs.
Okay.
We did a thing, we were struggling a lot with pronouns in this book. It was fascinating. I do not like the he, she pronoun combination when authors use it. I find it very laborious, to read through a book that says, him or her. I've never liked that. I mean, for the entirety of my writing and reading. So that's not a style I would use. I was very aware that the first book used the male pronoun and was very he-centric. We wrote it and I've done this with several other books where I alternate he and she, and very systematically, but that's also challenging because you have a power dynamic. Like if one pronoun is always more powerful than the other, you have to then alternate that. And, to like really be balanced is quite hard. And along the way, I discovered something that I offer all authors. And I think this is the way people will eventually write business books, is there's something called the singular they. And I had not really been aware of this. And there's a great Khan Academy thing on singular they, if people are interested. If you just type in, it's about 10-minute long video. And it talks about the evolution of language. And it uses a couple of other words that evolved from in the English language, but also in French, and how that evolution of pronouns has worked over time.
Is it kind of like the royal we?
It sort of is, but really powerfully in the notion of the singular they. We think of they and them as third person. Today in gender identity, they and them can be a pronoun that somebody uses for their own gender identity. But in writing, it's a very comfortable singular pronoun in terms of how it reads and how it writes. And in this particular book, we ended up using the singular they. And again, it was a discovery. I had never really thought about it. And I put it in the category of not trying to be gender aware, gender balanced, or whatever the right word is, but just like the writing was easier. It was more fluid. The reading is easier.
Brad, this has been fascinating. We've talked about linguistics now. We've talked about bioengineering. We've talked about global affairs. And we happened to talk about boards too. So,
Vinnie, I try never to be boring for you. I know that you have an interesting audience, and hopefully I'm mildly stimulating.
And you didn't want in wine. Thank you so much.
It's always my pleasure to hang out with you, even if it's virtually.
Thank you.